very quiet. Hello, everybody. I'm Tim Knowles, and I'm well mic'd. I'm the director of the Urban Labs, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about in a minute, and I also am the chairman of something called the University of Chicago Urban Education Institute. Today, what we're here for and what you came for is to hear a little bit and talk a little bit about a transformative, scalable, cost-effective approach to improving academic outcomes for young people in high school, which in my view is as instrumental as anything that we can do in urban schools particularly. I want to thank some categories of people: the Educate Forward, City Bridge, and Pew for helping partner in this endeavor. So where are you? Are you here? Some of you, maybe they're virtual. I particularly want to thank our partners from Chicago Public Schools, Rukia Kirby-Johnson and Ramona Fannings-Outlaw. Ramona is the principal of Harlan High School in Chicago. She's sitting in the front. And Rukia is the director of STEM for the system. And finally, I want to thank SAGA, which you will be hearing a lot about. SAGA, I want to thank you, Alan, and all your team for the work you're doing, which is quite remarkable to improve the lives of children in Chicago, but also across the country. So before turning to John Gurian, who is the PI and anchor on this project, a word about Urban Labs very quickly, and then I want to make two editorial remarks because I have a microphone about SAGA. Urban Labs got airborne to address the biggest challenges that cities face. We do this by identifying what we think are very promising policies and interventions, and then testing them using rigorous gold standard methods that you would find in healthcare, clinical trials, those sorts of things. And then, importantly, we're not just sitting in the academy identifying and testing things. We are as committed to ensuring that the things that we learn work are adopted and scaled in cities across the country and increasingly across the world. And SAGA is decidedly one of those things. Our work started in 2008 with the Crime Lab, trying to tackle violence, specifically in Chicago. In 2011, the Education Lab started, which John is the faculty director for. And 2 years ago, we started Poverty Lab, Health Lab, and Energy and Environment Lab to complement the education and crime work. The promise here is to build smarter policy and ensure that spending of scarce public and philanthropic resources is dedicated to things that we know work and that are cost effective. So quickly, two editorial comments about SAGA. This is where Alan, who is responsible for SAGA, gets nervous. One is this. The term du jour, personalized learning, I find ironic at times because it's du jour and people talk about it like it's a brand new idea. I grew up in Oxford. Oxford University has been doing personalized learning in the form of tutorials and one-on-ones for millennia, almost a millennia. I also find it ironic because often it suggests we're using technology. And so there isn't actually a person involved in the personalized learning. And one of the reasons technology has become sort of de facto part of how we think about personalized learning is because the costs are huge. The costs of actually delivering personalized learning are significant, and so people are trying to leverage technology. Clever idea, still a lot of evidence we need to determine whether this is actually adding value. But what SAGA has done, which I think is remarkable, is figure out a way to keep personalized learning personal with direct engagement between tutor and tutee, one-on-one or two-on-one, in a way that's cost-effective, where cost is not an obstacle for schools or school systems who are leveraging their dollars in clever ways. The second thing I want to say is how important it is that SAGA put its stake in the ground where it did. As I said at the outset, their focus first was 9th graders and 10th graders who come into school, in some cases, 6 or 7 years behind in mathematics. For much of in our political discourse and our educational policy discourse, there's a tendency to say it's too late to start anything in 9th grade. We have to download resources, time, attention to elementary or earlier. Clearly that there's lots of good data that suggests that is the case, but I think one of the most important things that SAGA is contributing to our national educational discourse is that for the 14 and 15-year-olds who come into high school, in some cases at 4th or 5th grade reading and math levels, that it isn't too late. And if we get smart about how we use our money and how we use our human capital, we can deliver really remarkable results. And with that, I'll turn it to John Gurian, who's the faculty director of the Ed Lab, the Education Lab, and also the professor of Human Development and Social Policy at Northwestern. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks everybody for coming. It's great to see you here. Thank you for being here on a day where you could be in Chicago watching the parade of for the Cubs having won the World Series. It's sort of amazing that the world still exists after the Cubs won the World Series. Maybe that's just my Chicago perspective. Okay. Okay, so I want to start with something that motivates a lot of the work that we do at the Ed Lab and at the Urban Labs more generally, which is the high school dropout problem. And while there has been some recent progress made in high school graduation rates in the United States in big urban school districts, for decades, the high school dropout rate in large urban school districts hovered somewhere around 50%. In places like Chicago, there's evidence that it's been increasing recently, but there's also a long-standing large gap in graduation rates that exist by racial lines and socioeconomic lines. So the difference in high school graduation rates between African American and white kids and Hispanic and white kids is large and has not changed dramatically over the past several decades. There's, as we all know, there are very large gains to finishing high school, going on to college, and increasing educational attainment. There are very bad outcomes associated with dropping out of high school, which have gotten, if anything, more important based on the way the economy works. Now, as a researcher, as you sort of think of that as a problem you're trying to solve, that there's lots of kids who are not finishing high school in a world where the benefits of finishing high school are as large as they've been in 30 or 40 years, you start by thinking, well, what is the reason? What are the root causes for these kids dropping out of high school, and for these sort of racial and economic gaps in educational attainment and achievement? And you sort of can come up with a list pretty easily of why that is, and a lot of them sort of boil down to things that are related to poverty. Growing up in disadvantaged circumstances, being exposed to all the things that are associated with poverty, and that sort of having effects on somebody over a long period of time. Now, as you sort of go down that route as a researcher, you sort of think, well, okay, so now we've got to end poverty. And that would be great, but it's also fairly depressing. If the only way we're going to solve this problem is that we have to end poverty, that you sort of sit there and you think, well, how are we going to do that? Now, lots of researchers and people sort of involved in thinking about public policy recently have sort of had, in a similar way of thinking, come to the conclusion that, well, maybe by the time somebody is 14, 15 years old, and they've been exposed to all the things associated with poverty, and they're far behind in school, 3, 4, 5 years behind in, say, math by the time they're in 9th and 10th grade, it's too late to do anything. That the stuff that's happening around outside of school makes it so hard to do anything in school that our educational dollars, our social service dollars, our public policy dollars would be more effectively spent if we just started to intervene early. That we should be doing early intervention and focusing on early intervention, and that by the time somebody is far behind and a high school kid, it's really too late. Now, I have personally done a lot of research on the intervening early side, and I agree that that is a great place to be spending public dollars because it's very effective if done the right way. But we at the Ed Lab and the Urban Labs want to sort of challenge the idea that it's also too late to be intervening when kids are in high school. And so that's sort of the question that motivates this research around SAGA. And so one of the things we thought was, well, maybe you don't have to end poverty. Maybe there's things that would work even if we can't end poverty. And maybe the things that we've been trying, we've just been sort of aiming at the wrong target. So I want to give you an example of sort of our thinking on this. So these are two math problems that kids in 9th and 10th grade are asked to do. And I was nice. I could have put up some trigonometry, but I didn't want to embarrass anybody. And I won't ask anybody to factor a polynomial right on the spot. But these are two problems that I have watched kids in the Chicago Public Schools in 9th and 10th grade not be able to do. Okay, so imagine that you can't do this, and then you're sitting in a classroom and this is what the teacher's talking about. Okay, now if that were me, and I love math and I love school, but if that were me and this were happening, I would get really frustrated and I would just not listen. Okay, now imagine you're the teacher and you've got a class of 30 kids, maybe more, and there are some kids who can't do that, but that's not every kid. Some kids can do this, and you've got to figure out a way to talk to a room full of 30 to 35 14, 15-year-olds with very varying levels of prior knowledge, and you're one person. It's a very daunting task. I mean, I teach at Northwestern University, where we have a whole system of making sure that the degree of variation in the abilities of the people who come into my classroom are as small as we can possibly make it. We make people write essays and take the SAT and the ACT and get letters of recommendations from every person you can think of, just to make it so that when I'm standing in front of the classroom, everyone has basically the same background. And still, it's really difficult to teach a room full of 30 to 50 people who have different levels of knowledge about economics that I teach before they get there. Okay. From the standpoint of without that sort of pre-screen, and there's all this wide variation, from the standpoint of the teacher, it's just a very difficult problem. Okay, so if you have kids who are in 9th and 10th grade and they don't know this, right? But not everyone is at that point. We have it's a big problem, but it sort of suggests that the solution to it has to be something that's individualized, right? So you're actually meeting kids where they actually are in their math knowledge. It's very intensive because we've got a lot of ground to make up, right? And so that's where SAGA comes in. So this is sort of the idea that if you're trying to solve the problem of kids being far behind and not making progress, and even if we just focus on math, lots of the things we try and do in schools is trying to improve instruction or improve the way that we deliver the material. But if you have this problem where the kids are at all different levels, like just improving instruction, or as I sort of say here, saying it louder, it's not going to work. Okay, so we need to change it. So that's where this idea of SAGA comes in. Okay, so what SAGA does is it has 2-on-1, tutorials that happen in school during a class period every day. So a kid who's in the SAGA tutorial it'll be in their schedule. It happens every day, just like a regular other class in their schedule. You walk into a classroom, there's like about 11 tutors and 22 kids, 2 kids at a table. They work with the same tutor every day. And because there's 1 tutor and 2 kids, they can individualize what they do. So it's very intensive, it's every day. It's individualized because it's 2-on-1, right? So that solves the problem. It's hard to teach a class of 30 people when everyone has different levels, but if there's only 2, one person can individualize what they're working on with kids. It's the same tutor every day, so they develop a relationship and sort of change the kid's mindset about their orientation towards math, their ability to learn math, and then changes the idea is that it changes their level of engagement. So we were interested in this program. We thought it seemed promising. As Tim explained, we like to test things very rigorously. Just because it sounds like it might work doesn't mean that it does. And so we want to test things. And the way that we like to test things at the Urban Labs is we like to set up a randomized controlled trial. So we do it the way you test the efficacy of a new drug. You randomly select some people to get the program. Other kids were randomly selected to be in a comparison group. They don't get the program. They just get the standard business as usual, what they would have in their schedule anyway. And because we chose randomly who gets the program, it's literally like a flip of a coin. The people who get heads get offered the program. The people who get tails don't. And because it was random, they should be about the same on average. And then we look at the end of the year and we look at outcomes like test scores and grades and whether they failed courses, et cetera, et cetera. And you can compare the kids who got heads and the kids who got tails. And if you see differences, then you can attribute it to the program because there shouldn't be any other reason for there to be differences between those 2 groups. Okay. So we did it a few years ago. We did it on a pilot basis in one school in the south side of Chicago in a neighborhood in Englewood, a neighborhood school called Harper High School. And we did it on a fairly small scale just to see if it would work, see if we could actually implement it in Chicago. It was paired with another program called Becoming a Man, which I won't talk about too much today, but you may have heard of. And at the end of the year, we looked at results, and there were these dramatic improvements in test scores and grades and course failures reducing, and we were just like, wow, that was pretty amazing. But it was a pilot, it was smaller, about 100 kids, and so we thought, okay, well, you can maybe get lucky on a small scale. So we said, well, we're going to do this. We worked with CPS and recruited 12 schools to do it in the second year, and randomized about 2,700 9th and 10th graders. For reasons that I won't go into that much, these were all boys that had to do with something from a previous study. And we randomly assigned them to either be offered the chance to be in the program or to the control group. This was in school year 2013-14. Okay, so these are the 12 schools. They're sort of spread around the school, mostly on the south and west side of the city. These are neighborhoods in the school, in the city. The darker, the shaded areas are the areas that have higher violent crime rates. So you can sort of see that we're not sort of cherry picking the schools that are the easiest to work in. We did that in 2013-14. All the kids who were offered the program were offered a chance to be in the program for 2 years. So 13-14 and then 14-15. At the end of year 1, we were able to secure some additional funding. The city got some additional funding. So we were able to expand the program. And so then in year 2, in addition to the 2,700, there were another 2,300 or so kids who were randomized and offered the chance. So we expanded from 12 schools to 15 schools, and we went from there being somewhere in the range of a little more than 600 kids being tutored in year 1 to between 1,000 and 1,100 kids being tutored in year 2. And so the nice thing about this is that in the second year, there's a set of kids who are sort of starting the program in the second year. And so it's a chance to basically see if we can replicate the results that we see in the first year. So now I'm going to show you what we found. In the first year, we found that if you just compare kids who were randomly assigned to be offered the chance to be in the program compared to the control group, the kids who got the program increased their test scores by a quarter of, like 0.27 standard deviations. I'll tell you what that means in a second. So that, let me just say, if you don't know what a standard deviation is, the main takeaway point is like, that's really big. Let me just tell you how big that is. So the black-white test score gap, which is just the average difference in test scores between African American and white kids, which is something that's, lots of study goes into understanding why that is and ways to narrow that. It is frustratingly not going away, and it is about 0.8 standard deviations. So in 1 year of tutoring, the kids in the program had an increase in test scores that was about 30% of the black-white test score gap. Okay? Another way to think of it is, if you look at sort of the average rate that kids learn and increase test scores in a year, these kids in the program got an extra between 1 and 2 years of math learning over and above what the control group got just in 1 year. Okay, so this is a very large increase. Okay. So that was year one, the math test scores. We also saw improvements in their math grades, so their grade point average in their math classes. Remember, they're all taking the regular math classes too, right? So you might think, well, the tutoring is really focused on, maybe let's say that they were just really trying to get kids to do well on tests, and they spent all their time just doing test preparation. What this is saying is that actually, even if that's true, the kids were actually doing better in their regular math class to the point where their math teachers are giving them better grades. So in year one, the control group's grade point average was 1.6 on a scale of 1 to 4. So on average, the kids in the program, the comparison group, had grades that were on the average between like a C and a D. And the kids who were in the SAGA tutoring, their grade point average increased by 35%. Because that was year one. Remember, we said we could do a replication, so in year two, this is a whole different set of kids who are randomly assigned in a second year, and we find something very similar. So it's 20% increase, so they go from 1.8 to 2.2. Another outcome that we measured was math course failures, so the fraction of kids who failed their regular math class. So about a third of the kids in the first year in the control group were failing their math class, and only a fifth were among the kids who were in the tutoring program. And in the second year, the effect was even bigger. Almost half of the kids in the control group in the second year were failing their math course, where again, only about a fifth of the kids in the tutoring program were. Okay, so we find big effects in the first year, and to the extent that we can measure outcomes in the second year, we find effects that are as big, and in some cases even bigger in a second year of replication. Now, one interesting thing is that the kids didn't just do better on their math classes. They actually did better in their non-math core courses, like English and science and history, things like that. Okay, so we actually found they were less likely to fail those other courses. So one possibility is that these are kids who were struggling in math, but they probably were struggling in lots of subjects. You spend every day with somebody who keeps telling you, no, you can do this, and then putting problems in front of you that are actually at the level that is a reasonable level of problem for you to be able to do. And so kids actually experience success on a day-to-day basis and realize, oh, if I put some effort into this, I can learn this stuff. And as I learned when I was very young in elementary school, learning is fun. So I learned that, and I decided I'm going to stay in school forever. And now I'm a tenured professor, and I never have to leave. They're just figuring that out in 9th grade again, that actually learning is fun, and that's not just math. Maybe that also carries over to their other classes, and it changes the way that they engage in school. So again, we found that in both first year and the second year. The other thing is, as Tim rightly pointed out, we care a lot about cost effectiveness, because we're trying to really find things that work, but also things that can really be implemented at large scale. We've done some estimates about what the benefits are of even just the test score increases in terms of long-term earnings potential for the students. And if you compare any sort of reasonable estimate, they're very, very large relative to the costs. And this gets back to something that we estimate somewhere between 4 to 1 and 16 to 1 benefits relative to costs. So it's a very good investment if you sort of think of it that way. This gets back to something that Tim pointed out, which I think is one of the sort of main insights that Alan and the SAGA team had, which is that, as Tim said, it's not news that one-on-one instruction is a good way to teach somebody, right? I mean, any of us with kids, like that's what we do when they come home and they're in trouble with their homework. We just basically do SAGA tutoring with them at night, right? That's what being a parent is about to some extent. Hopefully the SAGA tutors don't have this quite as much yelling and frustrating experiences as I do at night doing homework. But so one of the insights is that it's possible to have two-on-one tutoring, to give that to lots and lots of kids in a way that is potentially affordable for a large school district. So how is that possible? The reason it's possible is that what they've done is they've changed what a tutor is doing and simplified it in a way that they've greatly increased the set of people who can do this job relative to the people who could be a teacher. Right? So you sort of say, what skills do you need to be able to be a classroom teacher? Well, you need lots of skills, right? You need to be able to manage a classroom. You need to be able to, write a lesson plan. You need to be able to, be a good instructor.